welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome to Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. My name is Jessica. I am here with the author, Vanessa Lillie of The Bone Thief, which is actually a sequel, correct?
Yes, it is. It is. Some people have been reading it, as a standalone, but, I'm sure you guys get it. It's kind of nice to start with the first one.
Well, now I have to go back and read the first one.
Yes. So
yes.
You get to know Syd a little better, maybe through the first one. But she's still got a little growing to do in both.
Well, it does work. Yes, it does work as a standalone, but I do think, if you are not familiar with Syd Walker's character, The Bone Thief does give you some interest, into her, but also, going back and reading Blood Sisters, I'll say right now, as someone who is going to do that, you might want to do it because the writing is really good in this one, and I'm sure there's a lot of build up and some treats that I might have missed. But this was a really interesting book. So in your own words, what is The Bone Thief about?
Yes. So we follow Syd Walker, who is an archaeologist for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And she is white, presenting Cherokee, just like me. She's from northeastern Oklahoma, just like me, which that's where Blood Sisters, the first book, is set. But this book is set where I live now. And Syd, as a BIA agent, is called to a wealthy kids camp because some remains have been found. And she discovers they're most likely tied to what was a real historical battle here. It was the Great Swamp Massacre, which was a real turning point for the Narragansett tribe here during the colonial revolution and attacks. So she's got remains that, as the title may lend you to believe, are quickly stolen. And but the remains are not the only thing that's missing. There's also a teenage Narragansett girl who's missing. And Syd actually has a connection to her because she was her intern. And Syd wasn't the best boss, which I just thought was so interesting to explore. And she's got some guilt as well as just wanting to do right by the tribe that she serves. And all of this is connected to an elite secret society with ties all the way back to the Mayflower. So all of these things kind of combine for what I hope is a pretty good page turner, but with lots of indigenous realities and themes. And I'm just such a history person. I'm fascinated by how much history I don't know. And I learned so much moving to Rhode Island. I basically didn't know 99% of the history here. And so I love sharing that with readers.
Yeah, definitely. And there's a lot of things that the story touches upon. It definitely goes places. Syd also has a pregnant wife, by the way.
He sure does.
Yeah.
So she's needed at home, but it's always so funny, writing thrillers. People are like, why is she, she's always running off and she's got a wife at home. And I'm like, well, because you want to read it. And I promise you, it's not very interesting if she does the right thing and just stays
that
home.
would be a completely different book.
It would. Yes. And it's also not her personality. When I created Syd, I really wanted to create a character who would stop at nothing to ensure justice. I just think that's so important because so much of my books are around, like, the heart of them is around missing and murdered indigenous women. And so you need someone who's going to pursue justice at any cost. And I just think it makes a really interesting main character because you're never quite sure what they're going to do next.
So a few things without giving too much away. First of all, so we have the secret society you mentioned called the Founders Society.
Yes.
Like you said, they trace their lineage all the way back to the Mayflower. Some of them claim they want to do the right thing with that, but I don't know. Read the book, and you will decide whether or not, you think that they really do, or whether they're just kind of misguided and need to be better educated, or there's something else going on. That's all I'll say about that. But one thing that I found really interesting that kind of came out off the bat is just this idea, and I've heard this, and not being indigenous or but I have heard, there's always been like this trope of like, the Indian princess or queen, and
Hmm.
that's not really a thing, that didn't
Right.
really exist. And that's something that like these bones, they're just like it belonged to a queen.
Hmm.
And Sid's like, no, that's not really how it was.
Yep.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
I think it's so interesting because we're in a time now where there are more indigenous books and more indigenous voices, right? Thank goodness. But most of my life, the books I've read about indigenous people were from white people. And those stories go back generations. In fact, they go all the way back to the early days of colonialism where they used myths and stories and tropes and generalizations um, to other and dismiss and erase people. And the trope around this sort of, and honestly, the Cherokee tribe, we have a lot of, there's 500,000 people who are part of the Cherokee tribe. And, you hear that a lot. Like my grandmother was a Cherokee princess, and it's always a little red flag because, and it's not that the people are lying. I'm sure they were told that, but that has roots, real historical implications. Why, people claimed that identity sometimes so they could steal land. They also, there's some historical reasons depending on where they were from. And, it's also just a very kind of sweeping generalization that people use when they're not really connected to culture, right? It's like, oh, okay, well, what are you going to do with that? Let's say you really are connected to someone who was, a chief or a sachem. Sachem is the word out here they use for chief, who was pretty high up in the tribe. Like, does that mean you're actually connected to the tribe? Do you go to, the powwow? Do you go to cultural events? Do you, like, what is it that makes you say that? Why are you know what I mean? So I think Syd is pushing against these big generalizations that are so common because for the longest time, the narratives we have around indigenous people were not from indigenous people.
So I don't know how much you know about our area, where we're from. Syosset is supposedly there's actually a few different there's a few different myths around where the name Syosset comes from, but it's kind of widely considered to be either it's a derivative of an indigenous name or a Dutch name.
Mm-hmm.
However, there is a town called Sachem. We have Massapequa. We have
Mm-hmm.
Shinnecock, which is a
Mm-hmm.
tribe that
Yep.
does, they have a powwow at the end of every summer
Mm-hmm.
out here. You do, and we've been famously under the guise of many because I don't want to say most. I'm going to roll that back. I did not say most. Many
Mm-hmm.
of our school districts have mascots that are Native American,
Yeah.
and there's been a lot of like push and pull about, oh, well, do we keep this? Do we not keep this? But it is just again like it's there. It's like it's literally everywhere. You can't drive by a street name
Mm-hmm.
without it referring to something pre-colonial or the indigenous people. But again, it's not, the personhood is kind of in dispute. So
Right.
I did find all of that really interesting because it's like people love to talk about the history of things, but only in a certain context. And Syd kind of is, while trying to find Naomi, who is the missing
Mm-hmm.
teenager, and also make sense about what's going on with the bones, and also, with this whole trying to figure out the founders' society and whether they could be useful or they're just kind of another part of the whole system. Uh, it felt pretty solid to what I recognize.
Mhm.
So, what's the difference? Like, because I know the first book took place, you said in Oklahoma,
Yeah.
and the other one takes place in Rhode Island. Do you find a lot of difference sort of in the way that indigenous communities are regarded in these different areas?
I do. New England is really interesting. I've been here since 2011, and probably in your experience may mirror more that than Oklahoma. I mean, Oklahoma has there are other things I get into in Blood Sisters, which is like it's not that I was taught a lot of indigenous history as a Cherokee person. Oklahoma, like many states, they don't teach much indigenous, not even just history, like contemporary life, right? Like most classrooms don't go much beyond the Thanksgiving myth in a lot of ways. I mean, I think things are a little better, but they're not great. And there's statistics around that. But certainly, you know, there's tribal life is much bigger part of Oklahoma life because so many tribes were forced there, right? I mean, it's just there's such a bigger, and there are the heart and seat of tribes are, Tahlequah is the capital of Cherokee Nation. So, in that way, it's real. So, but that's not the case in New England. If you look at Rhode Island, for example, where the story is set, there is one tribe that is federally recognized, the Narragansett tribe. There are other tribes here, but only one has been federally recognized. And to be honest, it feels like a lot of what colonialism demands is erasure, because when you see a plaque on a house around a certain date, when you see a landmark or a sign around, most of those dates are around when the land was stolen from the tribes here. And it really was stolen, just as it was for my family from Tennessee. But we live here now. The homes and the culture and the generation after generation. And when you look at things like the Thanksgiving myth, that's so important for people's identity and this idea of land being passed over in a fair way, which is not true. And then what to me matters more, even though understanding history matters a lot, is understanding that these tribes are still here and they have a life and a culture and a resiliency that shouldn't be ignored. And we're very lucky because there is a museum here, the Tamaqua Museum, which is a museum dedicated to the tribes of Southern New England. And it's run by tribal people, which is we get into in The Bone Thief, why that's important. And so there's a lot of connections I think people could make in New England if they so choose. And some people do choose, but I have spoken to members of the Narragansett community who sat in schools and were told that their tribe no longer exists. So and there are schools that still have the same mascots that, are the outline of an Indian face, or there's, Metacom or King Philip, who is a part of King Philip's War. Like things like that are so ingrained that we almost don't even see it or question it, which is actually very important to continuing colonialism. It's very important to keeping resources and control, which is what I was exploring with the Founders Society, because it's sort of like, religion isn't really the currency anymore, right? It's more this sort of country club, resource control. That's colonialism now. It used to be more oriented toward the Puritans and control through religion, but God is not our God in America anymore. It's money, it's capitalism, it's resources, it's control, it's land, it's how we look, it's wealth and affluence, and I've noticed and why I wanted to kind of explore colonialism within that founder society pseudo country club thing is, I mean, when you look at a country club, and this isn't knocking people in country clubs, but the idea is that you kind of go to the same schools and you kind of have the same doctors and you have the same bankers and you keep, the wealth and control in an area, which is diametrically opposed to what happened to indigenous communities. They've been isolated, they've been economically oppressed. And there's some examples in this book that are taken from real history of Rhode Island. So kind of building a narrative around, and it's not that I have a clear answer for any of this, I circle it too, but I think we should think about it and maybe talk about it. And I think in New England, we really don't, because so many of us, including me, I'm not Narragansett, right? So I'm living on their land, are a part of that narrative to really think about what the implications are, and how we continue to oppress in order to keep our resources, to keep, our cognitive dissonance, really, to be able to kind of continue on enjoying our colonial architecture and our, by othering and erasing what really happened.
Another thing I want to talk about a little bit is how Syd kind of like, she gets like visions almost.
Yeah, so there's sort of like a figure that she's seeing, a woman in
Yes,
white. The
yes.
woman in white, I've got
Yes,
you.
yes.
Because in the first book, she sees a ghost. So
Yes. I did read back enough to know that.
Yes. So in Blood Sisters, she sees a ghost that's connected to a friend who died as a child. In The Bone Thief, she's seeing this woman in white who in some ways it feels like is maybe guiding her toward answers, and maybe guiding her toward possibly finding Naomi or finding out where the stolen bones are. And I love a seemingly supernatural element, whether or not it is, you sort of find out later. But I just think within thrillers, but even specifically indigenous thrillers, I think it's really fun to try to kind of add into some of that otherworldly connection, just because part of our storytelling is always kind of connected to, what's through the veil. And so I do, as a writer, enjoy kind of teasing readers and having them wonder, like, did she write a ghost story? Is that what's happening here?
Yeah, no, it was not a lot, but it was enough, and it did kind of it was interesting. So I know this, so this is the second book about Syd. Will you be writing more about her?
I hope so. Publishing is a business. We'll see how this one does. I don't have a contract for another one, but I think the fact that I got to write about where I'm from, my tribe, the community, and then now that I get to write about the place where I'm from, living now, and where I wrote all of my books, I do feel good about where Syd is at the end of The Bone Thief. But I do have other ideas for how her story could continue. So, just crossing my fingers that maybe someday I get to return to Syd's story. But I do feel really happy, that I got to write both of these books that really explore the tribal nations that are, such a big part of my life.
Thank you so much. Once again, this was Jessica with Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast. The Bone Thief is out October 28th.
Thank you so much for having me. And I'm chronically online, so everyone come say hi on Instagram.
All right. We are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.